Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the CFVGA Lunch and Learn webinar, Determining Irrigation Runtimes with Drip Tape. I'm Adrian Card, State Produce Specialist with Colorado State University Extension, and I'll be both your host and your presenter for today. At the end of this, you will be able to understand why and how to representatively sample soil directly based on current and maximum rooting depth. A key concept in this, maximum rooting depth. Or you'll be able to use grass evapotranspiration and rainfall data to understand daily soil water depletions. You'll be able to understand management, sometimes called maximum allowable depletions as a percent of available soil water, and understand how soil texture influences available water capacity, another key term you can see abbreviated here. You'll be able to convert gallons per minute, 100 feet of tape, to inches per hour. And you'll be able to use all of this knowledge to calculate run times and determine optimal irrigation for soil moisture management. In your registration emails, you would have received links to two fact sheets that I offered, one determining irrigation run times with drip tape, and the other one is benchmarking vegetable farm irrigation, abbreviating that title a bit. Follow along in those links. I'm basically going to unpack all of that for you so that you understand what's in there with a bit more detail and help you succeed in the use of that information. We'll look at why to sample, what the common errors are in sampling. Where are you in relation to the benchmark of data that I was able to produce with colleagues? How much soil water you have, how much can you lose, where is it in the soil, how to sample where it is, how much is there in the soil based on your sampling, converting gallons per minute to inches per hour, sort of the holy grail of drip, since most of irrigation is expressed in inches and not in gallons in terms of water applied. We'll run through a calculation and then look at some question and answer. Why sample? Many of you are proponents of soil health, practitioners of soil health. The pore spaces in soils are key to places where organisms can thrive. They are channels created by roots and earthworms and other critters that allow air to transfer into the soil from the atmosphere, creating places with both moisture and air for aerobic organisms to thrive. And those are the ones we want for very healthy soil. In a scenario like furrow irrigation, many of you will have seen massive volumes of water enter the soil. It drives the air out of the soil, at least temporarily, where the water is above the soil surface, and creating conditions in the soil where more anaerobic organisms are proliferating. Those are the ones that we don't want as much in terms of soil health. So, additionally, crop health, perhaps it's your number one, maybe it's your number two motivation. Crops that are yielding well, are very healthy, have great attributes that the market wants, that will help you with profitability. When we exceed this key term, this management allowable depletion, we will see drier soils and the dryness entering a hazard zone in which crops that dry that much, that have you've exceeded its management allowable depletion, and you're going to suffer yield loss and quality loss. The over irrigation similarly will leach soil nitrate, the version of nitrogen that moves through the soil very readily. It's going to create anaerobic conditions in the soil, again reducing crop health and yield. And think about pumping cost. So all of you would need electricity or some fossil fuel base to pump water. So why irrigate when you don't need to if you're over irrigating? On screen now for you, I wanted to show some of the tools that I've used in my career to better understand this. Agriculture Extension Agent in Boulder County, 2004 through 2022, and saw the need and was motivated to learn some of the technology and then install it on farms there so farmers could use it at very low cost. Under technical advising from me to help them learn how to irrigate and even teach some of their staff how to irrigate. So great teaching tool. Watermark sensors. I've been around what you see in this picture for some 30 or 40 years. Not to endorse one company, they are reliable in Colorado for our conditions, and are just very well known in terms of how they perform. CSU has had some experience with them too. So there are lots of other methods out here, but I'll show you these today. What you're seeing here is a very older version of how these work, hardwired back to, they're placed in the soil using these two tools, a soil core, and sometimes only, but always with the soil probe to firm the hole up. We want to have very tight sensor to soil contact so those two can exchange the sensor and the soil water, and we can see the drying that's taking place in the soil. These measure using electrical resistance in the tip of these. More water, wetter soils, less resistance, drier, less water, drier tip, more resistance. Whole nother webinar could be done on how to use those. Common errors that people make. One that I see that I like to joke about is that people are using the digital method. They're putting their digit in the ground, 4 inches with their finger in the soil to figure out what water is there. And that could be very accurate if we've got a seedling, a direct seeded crop, or a transplant that's rooted no deeper than that. Could be a great representative sample. If my crop is rooted much deeper, it's at a medium or a mid-life phase of growth, or it's fully mature, it's not representative. We need a sample 6, 9, 12 inches deep to understand what conditions are there. If we were to look at the soil and after a rainfall event and see that it's very wet, it could also be very dry below that finger sample. So if we don't sample more deeply where the roots are, that's the take-home message here, is sampling where the roots are taking up water. We won't know how to provide them with the optimal amount of water. The other error, irrigating by plant or soil appearance. The vegetable crops are mostly water, and if they dry down sufficiently to the point where they're wilting, we will see some winter squash in the summer, wilting midday. That's normal, but typically other crops, when we're seeing plant leaves look wilty with less turgor pressure, they are going to suffer a yield loss. We don't want them to get that far dried down. They don't want that stress. We don't want them wet all the time either. That's trending towards anaerobic conditions. We don't want that. We want it right in that very shallow oscillation between hitting the red line of when they need to be irrigated and wetting them up to what we'll see here shortly is field capacity, thereabouts. Other errors, irrigating by date. It's Tuesday, it's time to irrigate. It's Friday, irrigate again. Irrigating by intuition. I've done this for 30 years. I can feel the plants. I know when they need water. Maybe that's accurate. Maybe it's not. Others have told me that they irrigate for as long as the pump will run, as much gas is in the tank. So they have no idea how many inches per hour they're putting down. They just fill up the tank and run it. Finally, I think a large error that people make is not having a rain gauge. The ability to know how much it rained is simply impossible, and is without a rain gauge, and especially not having one on your particular field. I know farmers with fields miles apart, and one field could have gotten 3/4 of an inch, 2 inches of rainfall, and the other field 1/10 of an inch or less. So you can't assume, and most remote weather stations won't get that accurate for you. So put a rain gauge on every field. So one thing I wanted to point out to you is related to that soil appearance piece. Here is a schematic. Drip tape are the black dots, and they are in this schematic showing 16 inches apart. We got a plant that's planted right by the tape. The water coming right out of the tape is naturally going to wet the surface before water for gravity catches that water and starts to pull it down. In very clayey soils, clay-based soils, we're going to get more lateral movement of water. In more sandy-based soils, it's going to be more like a column or a straight down movement of water. This plant is, from its early days, going to get water quite readily. You could germinate seeds here if you needed to. That'd be much harder to do here. And this plant in its early stages is going to need much more water. So to get that wet, you're going to need to fully irrigate that entire rooting zone, maybe for 24 hours, and fill it up from the bottom up like a glass of water, more or less. You're going to get lateral movement through that, but to get the wetting fronts connected at the surface so that you see water at the surface requires a lot of water. And it's really only necessary when this plant's immature. Once it gets to root, it's going to find the water down here further. Let me show you what that looks like. In my garden, my drip tape is 16 inches apart. And in this picture, we see radishes planted on either side of the tape. And we see winter squash planted, zucchini planted right here. I have hand watered this zucchini a bit. But here in the middle, we don't see these wetting fronts connecting, right? Not on the surface. But if we dig into the soil, I did this here with my hand, about a hand's, from my wrist to my fingers, maybe less than that. I think it was about 4 inches at the most 6. We're beginning to see the darker soil here, the color change that would show us, and I could feel it, but just to show you that I can explain it, the wetting fronts are beginning to meet each other here at about 4 to 6 inches deep. So this seedling, now it needed a little help when it was super hot. Now it should be rooted well enough, little help with extra water, it should be rooted to get the water coming from these two tapes. Now, this would not be a great idea to plant in the middle of the tapes if I had soils with high salts. It would push the salts on the edge of that wetting front towards the middle. Wherever the wetting front goes, the salts are being pushed on that edge of the wetting front. So this zucchini could have much more salty conditions due to where I placed it between the tapes. If it was very salty, it'd probably be wiser to do it like I did the radishes, place the plant right next to the tape, and the wetting fronts can push the salts away from the plant roots and alleviate the salts, which can mimic droughty conditions. It interferes with the plant's ability to take up water, makes it harder for it to drink. So how does your irrigation management compare to peers? I was fortunate enough in my career, I had reached out to a great mentor of mine that I still work with, Mike Bartolo, state vegetable specialist with CSU Extension, now retired. When I first started in my role in 2004, and I asked Mike, I said, how much water do mixed vegetable farms use in Colorado? And he said, we just don't know. Nobody's really done the research. I said, well, why don't we try it? So I was fortunate enough to have the budget to buy some flow meters that you see pictured here, propeller type ones that were not as fancy as the ones on screen, a little bit cheaper, didn't need as much volume. Put them on very many different mixed vegetable farms. Most of these had multiple different crops in the same irrigation zones. We did the study, Sharon Boken and I, a colleague of mine, over 9 years. And here's what we found. The black line here and the orange line here, farms versus fields, both of them basically did average over a 160-day irrigation season, 21.5 acre inches per acre of water used. That's basically the May through late September irrigation period. But you can see we have outliers, right, in any average. So this farm, and we see it reflected over here in that farm's fields, we're way under irrigating compared to their peers. Other fields from particular farms, this farm C, two of its fields, well over irrigating compared to some of its other fields that you would see here, C over here. This one, incredible amount over the average, right? This was almost 3 times the average water use. And what would you imagine happened with these crops? Were they stressed? Were they in anaerobic fuel conditions? Did they yield well? Likely this is an unnecessary irrigation unless they're trying to leach something out of the soil. So this data, use it as a benchmark, as the fact sheet suggests, and it can give you some reference point should you be also using those flow meters, which I encourage you to do. It gives you great information about your farm, and you can let me know if you're interested. I can tell you more. Key concept in this: available water capacity and soil tension. So imagine that I had a field, and if you've seen furrow irrigation, put tremendous amount of water on a field in these shallow, very shallow ditches in a field. Completely saturates the soil. After that happens, we're seeing water now in very temporary storage in the field, and gravity's taking over and pulling all that excess water that the soil can't hold on to. The soil's ability to hold water, to think of it as like suction. It can suck and hold the water into the soil. It's not strong enough to hold all of it, but eventually it drains to the point where it can hold what's there. Its holding capacity, its field capacity, is the maximum amount of water that it can readily hold on to without it leaching out. And this water, at least half of it, is available in inches to plants. And we can express this per foot of soil as available soil water, or available water capacity in the soil. When the water available there drops below about 50% of the quantity of water there, in inches of water, plants are going to struggle to access it. And there are other plants whose ability to pull against that tug of war of the soil pulling, sucking the water, and the plant trying to extract it. Some plants are better at fighting the soil for water than others, and some really are challenged to do it, and they can't dry down as much. And we'll look at their management allowable depletion as an indicator of how much drying they can undertake. On the right, just as a check for yourself, I'm going to try to give you some practical ways to learn this in the field on your farm. The soil ribbon that you see here in clay soil is an indicator that the field is at field capacity. When you see that, if you can get the fingers are sticky, you can press it and make a ribbon of soil between your thumb and forefinger. We'll show you what that looks like in a couple of more slides. So available water capacity varies by soil texture. So we know that from intro to soils, sand, silt, and clay percentages of soil give us various naming conventions for types of soils. Clays, loams, silts, sandy soils. Today, we're going to look at sandy clay loam soils as in our example. But for perspective, here are the largest particles in the soil, sands, which don't hold water when they're all combined together very well. And the dominant percentage of mineral in the soil as compared to the blend of those, a loam holds water very well. Clay holds water very well, but it holds it very tightly. It has a very high tension. It can hold onto that water tighter than the roots can extract it. So here is a way to assess your soil texture by using what was emailed to you in registration. This link to this NRCS publication, Estimating Soil Moisture by Feel and Appearance. You can get the same information from a soil test, but doing it yourself, I think, is great. And you can see how sometimes soil texture changes by depth. We are today going to look at sandy clay loam soil, but should you be curious, this flow chart walks you through how to do the whole thing. And here's another example of someone ribboning soil. If you're really able, this guy's a pro, really able to ribbon it, that's an amazing ribbon that doesn't break. Would have a lot of clay in it and not very much sand. Available water capacity and soil texture. So we can see all of those naming conventions of different types of soils, from our sands over to our clays and silts, and then finally that combination of sand, silt, and clay, that's that sweet spot. It has the highest available water capacity, right? 2.4 inches per foot of soil. It can hold that much water that's available to crops. At least half of it is. Our example today, a sandy clay loam, it holds less, 1.8 inches per foot of soil. And you can see when it's had about 40 or 50% of that depleted, this chart developed really for agronomic crops instead of vegetable crops. So a corn irrigator, a grass hay irrigator, alfalfa irrigator, they would look at that depletion and know that in this range of water available or water depleted, however you look at it, they should irrigate. So management, some people say maximum allowable depletion, varies by crop. Those field crops, hay 50%, alfalfa 50%. Do I have field corn in here? I don't, but there are others that you can see it just varies by crop. Today, we're going to look at an example with peppers who have, they're water sensitive. They can't dry as much as some of the other vegetable crops, 25%. In this chart, you will find in the determining irrigation runtimes with drip tape. So we're going to help demystify a lot of that fact sheet today. Maximum allowable depletion, available water capacity, and centibars. How does it all relate? So I've explained some of this already, that the centibars, well, soil tension is that suction, but the centibars is a measure of soil tension. So the greater the centibar number, the greater the drying, the higher the soil tension. The soil is pulling harder because it's drying out. The plants can't extract water from it very easily. And again, that shaded region here explained that previously. If we had a 37, let's see, we'll back this out a bit. We're going to look at management allowable depletions as we did previously. The pepper could tolerate a 25% drying, and in a sandy clay loam soil, that is equivalent to about 0.45 inches of water lost when it's dried down 25% of what is available. And that would be equivalent to 1.35 inches available, which, you know, is right in here. We'd say it's roughly equivalent to 37 centibars. So if I'm out in the field and I'm reading or on my smartphone, reading a soil moisture report, a sample, and it said 37 centibars on peppers, I would know it's time to irrigate, right? Where to sample is highly dependent on the rooting depth. So what I want to explain to you over the next couple of slides is the chart that you see in here. The maximum rooting depth is mostly dependent, well, is largely in Colorado. We should think about it on the shallower side. So let's take a look at that. And as a general rule of thumb, think about, as previously we talked about, where the roots are in the example of the tape with the plant planted in between those shallow roots of younger plants. We need a shallower sample, and the more mature plants, a deeper sample. In Colorado, you should be considering, based on that table, erring on the shallower range of the maximum rooting depth. A key concept in rooting, and this is the reason why, the plants will take up about 70% of their water from the upper half of their rooting zone. For sampling really deep, it's interesting information to know about water that may be leaching deeper into the soil, percolating deeper. But if, for example, we'll see with peppers, or with tomatoes here, we're going to show you an example. Their maximum rooting depth, 24 inches, they're going to take most of their water from about 12 inches or less. When we're determining where to sample and how deep, we want to know if there's a compaction layer based on tillage. So you want to use a probe or other method to see if there's a compaction layer, because the roots will hit that and they won't go any deeper. They'll just splay out sideways, like they've hit the sidewalk almost. So let's look at these slides. These tomatoes, fully mature, they are about 48 inches from the bed height up. Here's a red tomato here, show you their maturity. So I dug a soil pit, thanks to a friendly farmer let me on the farm. These tomatoes were planted on a single line of drip on plastic mulch, a clay loam soil in Longmont in August 2012. And you can see in the top 8 inches, a lot of feeder roots, a lot of smaller roots that are accessing that more shallow water where most of the water exchange is taking place. The irrigation's there. The water's easy for the plant. The deeper they have to pull it from, the more energy it takes. That's why we're seeing more water pulled from the top half of the rooting zone. I go deeper and I begin to see the emergence of more of these roots that are seeking deeper water. They're thicker, they're not fine. And I go deeper, and just to show you here, I'm sampling about 10 inches away from the drip tape. So I get that expanse of the wetting front as it's moving out in the soil. It gets wider. I can see where the roots are moving into where there's water. Keep going deeper, more mass of roots down here at around 12 inches deep that are seeking more water, less fine roots. And I keep going even deeper And the mass of roots really begins to decline as I get down to 20 inches, 22 inches in the soil. So what I'm now discovering is basically the maximum rooting depth of, how deep it's going to root in Colorado, where our soils warm up more slowly. They don't get as warm as deeply as we're not California, Florida, Georgia, southern tier states, Florida, where the soil can warm so much more, roots travel more deeply. So all that to say, advising you that it's likely wiser in this chart to use the more shallow maximum rooting depth when you're sampling, as that's the reference range. Where to sample? Again, back to that schematic where I've got a drip tapes here as the black dots. Take home message from this graphic is sampling right below the drip tape is likely giving you a sample in an area that is more wet than other areas laterally away from that wetting front. So as the water's going down in a column, it's probably going to deposit more water directly down because of gravity and maybe less water off to the side. So I would like to guide you towards sampling and determining irrigation runtimes in such a way that I don't help you or cause you to water stress your crops. Don't want you to over irrigate either, but very important not to water stress vegetables. So don't sample underneath the tapes. In the case of plant number 2 here, sampling some distance away from the tape, but still in that rooting zone where it overlaps with the wetted front. And you can put a soil core in the ground and kind of determine this yourself. That's going to be the spatial location, and also then to a depth appropriate to the rooting depth. So these guys, very young plants, very shallow sample, maybe even your finger at this point would be just fine. And over here where this plant number 1 can intercept both of the wetting fronts from each of the tapes, think about long term as this plant roots more, sampling here, more in it towards its side where it might be able to intercept both of these wetting fronts if they are able to cross over underground. But basically, think like a root and try to think about what would be the average, not all the water that the soil gets and not the drier spot, thinking the average, and you're probably being a safe mathematical calculation of when to irrigate and how much to irrigate. This booklet here from NRCS is a great place to start, but I'm going to explain very quickly that it is quite generalized. It works well for crops that can tolerate this 50% depletion, but in my case of peppers, that only wants to tolerate, this is expressing it in percent of water available. 75% available is the same as 25% depleted in the case of our maximum allowable depletion, management allowable depletion of 25% for peppers. Theirs is a 25% available, the kind of trigger for when we want to irrigate. But note that I think about tomatoes, which those can dry some 45%, that it would put me somewhere in this range, right? But this sample, how would I know if I'm well overshooting a 45% depletion? It's just not that accurate. It's a great place to start, great place to get to know the soil and all of these concepts, but please upgrade your knowledge to more accurate sampling as you go. Won't spend much time here, but to say that direct soil measurement, probably better for accuracy and convenience, and probably your trust that what you're seeing in data is really representative of your farm, because it's coming from your field data versus ET data that is generated from remote weather stations. You can access these through CSU's co-AgMet system. And it requires a bit more math here to come up with, people would use a water balance approach where they would look at the evapotranspiration from grass and use a coefficient based on the crop's growth stage, its leaf surface area, essentially, to understand what percent of the grass ET that crop is using on a daily basis, how many inches of water on a daily basis. And then we'd have to subtract from that the water applied, if any, and any precipitation to understand how much water inches to apply back. So there are systems now that apps that can do some of this math for you, at least show you remotely instead of the hardwired system that I'm showing you in the picture here in the watermark sensors. Wouldn't need a data logger in the field. You can get the data back on your phone. So technology is much more advanced than what I'm showing you in many of these slides, but showing you some entry ways to get into this practice. Eventually, we'll talk about developing sort of a cheat sheet that would show you how to complete this from the data you would get, and then some reference in your calculation of how long to run it. So we're headed in that direction here in just a couple slides. This, an unfortunate typo in this slide. Let's see if I can correct it live with us while we're here. I think I can. Drip tape, GPM, gallons per minute per 100 feet of drip tape to the inches per hour that we're most comfortable with in terms of irrigation. We always talk about inches per hour applied. That's rainfall in inches. That's the language of irrigation. Flow is gallons per minute. That's great for pumping systems, but it's we want to know inches. So the most common error that people will make when they look at this chart is confusing in this first column that this is emitter spacing. This is not emitter spacing. This is the space between tapes, much like I showed you previously. The tapes that I'm using, I'm putting 16 inches apart in my garden. So, for example, the manufacturer has told me that the flow rate for that tape is 0.65 gallons per minute per 100 feet of tape. Excuse me. So just the X and Y axis connects here, and we can see at 16 inches apart and 0.65 GPM per 100 feet, I am irrigating almost half an inch per hour. And the example we're going to see next, we're going to look at tape that is 12 inches apart, has a flow rate of 0.35 GPM per 100 feet. So it's putting out less water than my system. Its output 0.34 inches per hour. Important to remember, drip is more efficient if used correctly. Furrow, 40% efficient, sprinkler 70 to 80% efficient, drip about 90% efficient, but it's not 100% efficient because we're going to lose some to perhaps deep percolation, some to evaporation. The crop can't access all the water that is deposited onto or into the soil. But encouraging you to strive for as much efficiency as you can. Let's not be this irrigator over here who's way over irrigating, wasting water. That's not efficient. And this person, hyper efficient, but is suffering significant crop yield losses because they're under irrigating. Let's find that sweet spot, whatever that is for your situation of your crop's needs on your farm. That is optimal. It's going to give you no excess water, soil health, crop health, profitability, and success towards your goals. So here's your calculation. Runtime. The sandy clay loam soil is has available water capacity of 1.8 inches per foot of soil, and we have peppers planted, and their maximum rooting depth is 20 inches. So remembering that the sample, we're going to find that sweet spot where we go not underneath the tape, but how far down. Let's imagine that the middle of that rooting zone, a 9-inch sample is going to hit us squarely in the middle of the rooting zone, towards the bottom of that, where more of those feeder roots are before the plant's really pushing down bigger roots to try to find deeper water, not wanting to exert more energy from that depth, 70% of that water from the upper foot of the soil. Our sample from 9 inches shows we're measuring in centibars from the perhaps watermark sensor that we're using, that it's 37 centibars. And we could go back and look at that chart, remember, and determine that we have lost, that at 25%, we've lost 0.45 inches of water. So here's the math there. At 25% depleted, is the maximum management allowable depletion for peppers. We've lost 0.45 inches of water. We need to replace it. Again, the tape specs here yield tape and tape spacing. 0.34 inches per hour of water is being applied given our tape performance and spacing on the bed. Inches of water to be replaced, 0.45. Inches of water per hour from the tape applied is 0.34 inches, and thus 1.34 hours of runtime are needed to create, to refill the soil back to field capacity. However, that's only if the system's 100% efficient, right? And we convert that then to minutes, but we need to factor in that it's only 90% efficient. So we divide the 79 minutes by 90% efficiency. It's for 88 minutes of total runtime. The interesting part of this, because you're imagining, Adrian, I don't want to do all of this calculation every time, right? And I believe probably in the marketplace, we're going to find vendors with apps that would do this for you. I haven't researched that. I haven't had the budget to do it recently. But if you look at my low-tech way, my low-tech wired watermark sensors back to a data logger, I would put a cheat sheet in there, laminated for producers, identifying where the sensors were, on what crop, at what depth, what their management allowable depletion is, and what that was in centibars. And that would be enough for the owner of the farm to go to a worker and say, go check the data logger, see what the centibars are at 9 feet on the peppers. If they had done the calculation once, like we see on screen, we could have also added that to the cheat sheet. So if you had the luxury of that one crop in an irrigation zone, or maybe you're running the irrigation zone with sensors on peppers and maybe another one on tomatoes and another one on winter squash. I don't know what would be in your irrigation zone, but you could then monitor 3 spots and it would give you a graph and show you what soil moisture was doing every time you press the button on this thing. In short, you could do the math once on the peppers, put it on your cheat sheet, and have some point of reference for how long to run for that particular irrigation zone of mixed crops in there. So that walks us through our calculations, lots of information to deliver to you in a compressed amount of time. I want to look at a couple of questions that we have here and see if I can help with answering some of that. So one that I see, the drip tape in the soil, how deep, if the tape is put in the soil with subsurface drip at some 14 inches, how does that water get to the surface? I think is the crux of that question. So subsurface drip irrigation has been around for probably longer than my career. I think it would have started perhaps as early as the late 80s, and then the 90s, certainly beginning to gain some traction with some producers. In the early days of subsurface drip irrigation, 14 inches might have been the standard and likely was for many of those installations. And to get water from 14 inches deep, think about, as we discussed previously, that we would need to fill that soil profile from the bottom up with water, maybe running it 24 hours to get it all the way to the surface, with lots of variables of what's the soil texture? Is it a clay soil? Is it sand? How closely spaced are the tapes? What's the flow rate of the tapes? But the depth of subsurface drip irrigation anymore has greatly decreased, so that the tape is now put in with GPS systems on tractors, so that the grower knows exactly where the tape is. Now likely arranged at the very deepest a foot, more likely 10 to 8 inches deep in the soil. And you can imagine that this really requires incredible forethought, because you're then going to sacrifice any deep tillage such as moldboard plowing. It's likely possible to still go in and do some degree of subsoiling in those areas, and very light disking, very light rotary tillage. but 8-inch tape is not very deep in the soil. So that's where it's trended to. Large volumes of water would get it to the surface. What I'm seeing more so with growers is because subsurface drip is expensive to install, and many growers that I've seen in my career are renting ground. They wouldn't go to that expense to install that on land that they don't own. So they would shank the tape in. Often this is in one pass. A plastic mulch layer with putting plastic down first, quickly behind that. Drip tape goes on a shank 2 inches, maybe 3 below the surface, and maybe 2 lines of drip on a bed. And the plants are planted accordingly, either on the tape or between the tape, often very close to it, not very far away, like some of my examples. And this would allow that water that otherwise would have taken a long time to get to the surface for any sort of germination. This could be done even on bare ground to germinate or irrigate transplants that are put in right immediately after the tape's in the ground. So let's see. Another question relates to dry land production and how to advise on that. I think the best, what would we do, tape on the surface or buried tape? I would want to know more. Is it perennial system? Is it an annual system? Are we talking about needing a direct seed or transplant? So contact information, just shoot me an email or call me. We can talk through that one. The other one I see here, the community garden, unknown, the drip tape that remains there, the specs on it are long gone. How do we figure out how many gallons per minute per 100 feet of tape? I was played around with this years ago and imagined that the researcher that perfected that table that I adapted with permission must have used some system where they strung tape out and used a basin to collect it to then extrapolate that inches per hour per 100 feet of tape. And then maybe put tapes in closer distance from each other and measured the volume of water and converted it to inches per hour. I didn't have great success with that, but we'll be happy to, since you're a CSU colleague, for us to work through that offline and figure out what's the way to find the solution to that mystery. But I think we can figure it out. So, but happy to support you guys in your quest for optimizing your irrigation through drip. And hats off to all of you who are struggling through the 2027 low snowpack, drought, irrigation season. It can't be easy. So I wish you the best in your pursuits. And let's see, any other questions? I think we got it. Okay. Well, thank you all so much for joining today. And also, if you should find the CSU's fact sheets under review at times, and those fact sheets that I referenced are no longer available, I can provide you with some hard copy of those, some files, not hard copy, a PDF file that likely, they're not, to sign the author, they're not needing any new review. You can feel confident in that. We want to do our best to keep them up to date. It's a process that CSU has to ensure the best in our library of materials to you. But we also don't want to leave you hanging when you need information. So know that we're here to support you. Wish the best for your production season. And thank you so much for joining in today.